"Hey, what do you think you're doing here?" Naomi froze as the voice rang out sharply across the quiet suburban street. Neighbors she had just begun to greet politely were now glaring at her, some whispering to each other, others pointing fingers. She had only been walking her dog along the sidewalk, enjoying the crisp morning air, when suddenly every assumption, every bias they harbored seemed to descend on her all at once. The dog's leash slipped slightly from her hand as her heart raced, her calm demeanor tested by the sudden hostility. "I'm just walking," she said carefully, hoping reason might cut through the tension. But the crowd was already forming, a wall of suspicion and judgment surrounding her. "You, watching this story unfold, pause for a moment. Who are you? Where are you watching from today? What city? What neighborhood? What corner of the world?" If you're intrigued by real stories of resilience, injustice, and courage, make sure to subscribe to this channel now and hit that like button so you don't miss the lessons these stories have to teach. Returning to Naomi, she tried again to explain herself, her voice steady though her pulse raced. Every movement, every simple gesture she made seemed to be interpreted as proof of wrongdoing. A neighbor stepped closer, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, as if daring her to make a mistake, to prove their suspicion right. She glanced around, recognizing the faces of some who had nodded politely when she introduced herself days before, now transformed by doubt into silent accusers. Whispered comments floated through the air, punctuated by the occasional harsh word accusing her of intruding, of acting strangely, of being an outsider. Naomi held her ground, knowing any reaction born from fear or anger would only escalate the situation further. She reminded herself of every rule she had lived by: patience, composure, clarity, but even the calmest logic seemed drowned out by the sudden tide of prejudice. She recalled the moment she signed the lease for her new apartment, the excitement she felt imagining herself in this neighborhood, the friendly smiles that had greeted her the first day she moved in. And now, in a matter of minutes, all that goodwill seemed to vanish, replaced by suspicion she had done nothing to earn. The confrontation grew as more neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the rising voices, curious to witness what appeared to be a scandal on an otherwise peaceful street. Naomi's dog whimpered softly at her side, unaware of the invisible storm, yet instinctively sensing the tension in the air. Someone snapped a picture with the phone, another began recording, and the sense of being watched, judged, and misinterpreted intensified. She took a deep breath, focusing on the facts. She was on her own property or sidewalk, her actions were lawful, and her intentions pure. But as she spoke, trying to clarify, she realized that for some, no amount of explanation would overcome the weight of preconception. The neighbors exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others muttering under their breath about what they thought they had seen. Naomi recognized that the real challenge was not just proving where she was or what she was doing, it was facing the undercurrent of fear, bias, and assumption that had allowed strangers to feel justified in confronting her so aggressively. As she attempted to continue walking, someone blocked her path, forcing her to halt, raising voices louder this time, demanding answers she could not give quickly enough. A woman called out accusations that made no sense, referencing things Naomi had not done, stories that seemed drawn from imagination rather than observation, yet delivered with the conviction of truth. Naomi's heart sank as she realized the full extent of the misunderstanding, compounded by subtle racial prejudice, fear of the unfamiliar, and the eagerness of the crowd to find someone to blame. She remained calm, speaking clearly, repeating herself patiently, attempting to de-escalate a situation that had spun entirely out of proportion. Still, every attempt to reason was met with suspicion, disbelief, or outright hostility. Naomi could see some neighbors hesitating, torn between curiosity, fairness, and the pressure of the group, but the louder, angrier voices dominated, creating an almost impenetrable wall of judgment. And in that moment, Naomi understood that this confrontation was not about her dog, her walk, or any minor action. It was about perception, fear, and the readiness to assume the worst based on who she was and how she looked. She stayed grounded, reminding herself that composure and truth were her only allies. And as the crowd pressed closer, cameras raised, whispers growing, Naomi prepared herself for the long challenge ahead, proving her innocence in the face of collective misjudgment, standing firm despite humiliation, and hoping that reason and patience could eventually pierce through the fog of assumption and prejudice. Every word she spoke was deliberate, every pause measured, every gesture controlled. She could feel the tension like electricity in the air, the weight of countless opinions pressing down, yet she refused to shrink. Naomi knew that courage was not always loud, that strength was not always visible, and that sometimes the greatest battles were fought quietly, with dignity intact, even as the world seemed determined to see you fall. The neighbors continued their murmuring, some still leaning in, some already forming conclusions. Naomi remained where she was, calm and composed, eyes forward, heart steady, determined to let the truth, eventually, carry more weight than fear, rumor, or bias ever could. The days after the confrontation felt heavier for Naomi, as if the quiet suburban air carried whispers that followed her everywhere she went. The morning after, she noticed blinds shifting when she stepped outside, faces quickly disappearing behind windows, and the same neighbors who once exchanged polite nods, now turning away as if avoiding an uncomfortable truth they had already decided for themselves. Word about the incident had spread faster than she imagined. Someone filmed part of the confrontation, and although the footage showed nothing wrong, the comments added underneath twisted the story into something far more dramatic and accusatory. Naomi saw phrases like suspicious activity and strange new neighbor, comments that assumed guilt without any evidence, comments from people who had never spoken to her yet felt confident assigning her motives. It was as if a single misunderstanding had bloomed into a neighborhood-wide narrative, one she couldn't control. Still, she tried. She approached a few neighbors individually, hoping that calm conversation might undo the damage, but each attempt revealed how deeply the assumptions had taken root. One neighbor claimed she had seen Naomi looking into garages, though Naomi had never stepped near any. Another insisted she had walked too close to packages on porches, as if proximity proved intent. Every word she tried to say in her defense met a wall of polite but firm distrust, a quiet dismissal wrapped in forced smiles that said more than their actual words. The more she tried to clear her name, the more she realized she was pushing against something larger than a misunderstanding. She could feel the old, familiar weight of prejudice settling over her world again, a weight she had hoped this new chapter of her life would leave behind. She walked her dog at different times to avoid confrontation, but even then she could sense the tension, the way footsteps paused when she approached, the way conversations abruptly shifted. She reminded herself daily to stay composed, to stay patient, but even the strongest resolve can waver when it feels like an entire community has silently judged you unworthy of trust. Then came the moment that made everything even worse. A package went missing from a porch 2 houses down, and although Naomi had been inside her home that entire afternoon, whispers started immediately. The neighbor across the street asked loudly whether the new girl had been seen outside. Someone else mentioned they had heard she was wandering around again, despite never witnessing any such thing. The story grew the way rumors always do, quietly, easily, without evidence. Naomi scrolled through the neighborhood's online group, reading each post in disbelief as more and more people chimed in with their own unfounded suspicions. Some wrote that they felt unsafe. Others asked whether anyone had checked in on her background, as if existing in their community required permission. The shift was no longer subtle. Every glance felt like a challenge, every silence an accusation. People she had never met seemed confident in their conclusions about her character. Still, she held on to what she knew. She had done nothing wrong. She refused to let anger cloud her voice or fear dictate her actions. But even determination begins to crack when the world refuses to listen. A few evenings later, Naomi heard a knock on her door, not loud, not harsh, but the kind of knock that promises complications. A group of neighbors stood there, including the ones who had accused her before. They said they needed to discuss the recent issues in the neighborhood. The tone was politely hostile, the type that drips with civility while carrying sharpness underneath. They implied she was involved in the missing package because someone thought they had seen her earlier. She explained she had not left her home at all that day, offering details, timelines, even referencing a call she'd been on for work. But the group barely listened, nodding stiffly, asking questions that didn't make sense, questions clearly designed to confirm their narrative, not uncover the truth. When she asked whether there was any actual proof, the room fell quiet. Someone muttered that, "It's just strange how issues started after she moved in." The sentence hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Naomi realized then that she wasn't fighting rumors, she was fighting assumptions that had taken root long before she arrived. Later, as she sat alone in her living room, Naomi decided she could no longer rely on explanations to clear her name. She needed evidence. She needed the truth to speak louder than the noise around her. Over the next few days, she documented everything: dates, times, interactions, the strange pattern of accusations, even recordings from her doorbell camera that showed her not leaving the house when events were supposedly happening. She spoke to the few people in the neighborhood who had treated her kindly, asking whether they had seen or heard anything. One elderly neighbor, quieter than the others, mentioned seeing someone else walking near the house where the package went missing, someone who didn't match Naomi at all. Hope flickered for the first time in days. Naomi thanked them, holding onto that small thread, knowing even a single piece of truth could shift everything. But before she had the chance to share what she'd found, the situation escalated again. Another rumor circulated claiming she had been seen lurking around late at night, despite her having been in bed. Neighbors gathered near the sidewalk one afternoon, whispering as she passed, turning away when she glanced their direction. Finally, one of the loudest critics called her out publicly, saying the neighborhood deserved answers. Naomi stood there, calm on the outside, but inside she felt the weight of every accusation pressed against her, as if her innocence had been swallowed by the loudest voices. A small crowd formed, bigger than the first confrontation, angrier, more confident in its assumptions. Naomi looked at them all, knowing this moment was unavoidable. She had prepared for this. She had gathered proof. She was ready to speak. And now, surrounded by a circle of suspicion, she realized that this confrontation would determine everything: her reputation, her place in the neighborhood, the truth they had refused to see. She took a slow breath, steadying her voice, ready to reveal what they had never expected. The truth was about to surface, and nothing would be the same after that. When the morning light spilled across the quiet neighborhood, Naomi felt a strange kind of stillness settle over her, as if the world itself was holding its breath right alongside her. The shouting from the night before echoed faintly in her memory, not as sharp as it had been in the moment, but still carrying all the weight of accusation and fear. She had spent hours replaying every detail, trying to understand how a simple walk home had turned into a public confrontation that nearly tore apart her sense of belonging. But as the new day arrived, she knew there was no use in hiding, no value in shrinking herself to make others comfortable. So she stepped outside, determined to face whatever waited. The neighbors were already out, scattered across porches and driveways, pretending to be absorbed in their routines, while clearly watching her from the corners of their eyes. Naomi felt each gaze like a test, some curious, some cautious, but others plainly hostile. She kept her head up. Eventually, one woman approached her, the same woman who had remained silent the night before while the accusations flew. Her voice trembled slightly as she apologized for not speaking up, admitting she had been afraid of making trouble with the louder voices on the block. Naomi listened quietly, understanding more deeply than the woman realized. Fear had shaped the entire confrontation: fear of difference, fear of assumptions, fear of saying the wrong thing. And that fear had been allowed to grow louder than truth. More neighbors joined, some offering hesitant words, others avoiding the subject entirely, but clearly wrestling with the memory of what they had witnessed. Naomi didn't demand anything from them, didn't lash out or lecture. She simply told them what the experience had felt like from her side. The shock, the humiliation, the danger of being endlessly misjudged. And something in her honesty shifted the tone around them. The tension softened, not because the harm had vanished, but because they were finally willing to see it. Even Daniel eventually appeared at the edge of the group, looking far less certain than he had the night before. The anger that had fueled him seemed burned out, leaving behind something closer to embarrassment, maybe even regret. He didn't attempt to defend his assumptions again. Instead, He quietly admitted that he had acted on instinct, without questioning whether that instinct was biased, shaped by years of stories told about people who looked like Naomi. It wasn't a full apology, not the kind that repaired anything immediately, but it was the beginning of acknowledgement, and that mattered more than he realized. Naomi accepted his words without offering forgiveness he hadn't earned yet. What she wanted wasn't to soothe his discomfort, but to make sure he understood the magnitude of the moment that his voice, raised in accusation, could have changed her life forever. And as Daniel stood, nodding slowly, it became clear that he finally understood. The neighborhood itself began to shift in the days that followed. Conversations that had once been buried were pulled into the open. People questioned their habits, their reactions, the assumptions they made without thinking. Naomi didn't lead these discussions intentionally, but her presence became the catalyst for them. Every time she walked outside, people approached her, some apologizing, some reflecting, some simply trying to connect. It was exhausting at times, but it was also healing. Not because everything had been fixed, but because change had finally started. One evening, the neighborhood held a small gathering in the communal courtyard. Nothing formal, nothing grand, just people sharing space, without the weight of hostility hanging in the air. Naomi hesitated before going, uncertain if this was genuine reconciliation or just an attempt to smooth things over quickly, but when she arrived, she saw sincerity in the atmosphere. People greeted her not out of obligation, but out of genuine recognition. They understood now how close they had come to inflicting real harm, and they didn't want to repeat that mistake. Naomi shared her own reflections with them, not preaching or accusing, but simply telling the truth of her experience. She spoke of how exhausting it was to always be alert, always be aware of how she might be perceived, always be ready to defend her existence in spaces where she should have felt safe. Her words resonated more deeply than she expected, not because the neighbors fully understood her reality, they couldn't, but because they finally cared enough to listen. In the middle of the conversation, a young neighbor, barely in her teens, stood up and said she wanted to grow up in a place where people didn't assume the worst of each other. Her voice shook, but her sincerity filled the space with a quiet kind of hope. And in that moment, Naomi realized something important. Healing wasn't a single gesture, a single apology, or a single conversation. It was a series of small steps, each taken by people willing to confront their own blind spots and do better. Naomi didn't forget what had happened. She didn't pretend the fear she felt that night simply vanished. But she allowed herself to acknowledge the possibility of progress, of a community learning to see one another clearly instead of through the distorted lens of suspicion. As the sun lowered behind the rooftops, casting a warm glow across the courtyard, Naomi felt a sense of calm she hadn't expected, not because everything was perfect now, but because she had refused to let the confrontation define her place in the neighborhood. She had stood firm, spoken truth, and demanded recognition of her humanity without ever raising her voice. And in doing so, she had changed the course of the community around her. The moral of Naomi's story is that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it speaks softly but firmly, refusing to shrink in the face of prejudice. It reminds us that justice begins with each of us, our choices, our reactions, our willingness to question the stories we carry about others. And it shows that change, even when painful, is possible when people choose understanding over fear. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video. Your support helps us share more stories that matter.